In the low hours of dawn on May 16, 2025, a place designed to confine violence became, for a few hours, a theater in which order failed. The Orleans Parish Justice Center, newer than many of the city's older institutions, and built with the explicit goal of improving correctional conditions after a long history of failure, housed more than 1,000 men and women. On that morning, 10 of them were not where they were supposed to be. The discovery was not a sudden alarm, but a slow, rolling realization. A head count that did not match, beds empty, doors that should have been closed standing ajar. The absence moved through the facility like a chill. In immediate aftermath, the escape looked at once ingenious and almost slapdash. The men had exploited a weakness that neutralized much of the architecture's advantage. The plumbing and the thinness of the partitions that the jail's designers and maintenance staff had long known were vulnerable. By removing a combination sink toilet unit that could be unbolted when the water was off, they exposed a cavity behind the wall, and then used it as a route into the service corridors, through the loading dock, and out past a barbed wire fence. The image that circulated afterwards, a jagged hole where concrete and steel were meant to stand, was both literal and symbolic. The breach was physical and moral. The hole itself, photographed by news crews, was accompanied by scrawled graffiti that read like a taunt. Casual, mocking, as if the fugitives wanted to make the point that the fortress was only as strong as its weakest bolt. Within the next hours, state and federal resources were marshaled. The sequence was almost standardized. Local police issued alerts, law enforcement erected checkpoints, and television cameras began to register the city's growing alarm. But the political and human fallout unfolded in parallel. For residents who watched the early footage of inmates crossing a busy highway after escaping to the loading dock, the images were stark evidence of negligence and risk. The story was not simply that 10 men had fled, several of them accused of violent crimes, but that public servants had been entrusted with their custody and had failed. As the details in the list of escapees emerged, those entrusted with oversight were forced into the public glare. Press conferences were scheduled, promises for internal reviews were made, and demand grew for answers not just about how the escape had happened, but why so many long-standing complaints about the jail had not been remedied. Among the 10 fugitives, one name stuck in the headlines with intensity the others did not match. Derrick Groves was already known to prosecutors, victims' families, and the criminal justice system for violence that had, in previous years, ruptured a neighborhood and claimed lives. By the time of the escape, he had been convicted of a major homicide and was serving a life sentence. Groves' record made his disappearance particularly worrisome. A man with prior convictions for violent offenses who disappeared into the city's fabric presented a unique risk profile. More than that, his absence was a political and moral symbol. Someone who should have been secure inside a cell was loose among the public. The intensity of the response that followed reflected the overlapping anxiety of victims' families, the political leadership's fear of blame, and the pragmatic priorities of police chiefs and marshals who would have to coordinate a search that might cross state lines. The immediate public explanation provided by officials was sober, even evasive. At first, law enforcement described a jailbreak discovered at morning count and a subsequent massive manhunt. Then, as reporting deepened, details leaked that the escape likely involved internal help or, at minimum, exploited systemic failures. Faulty locks, cameras offline, incomplete head counts, and understaffed shifts. Critics seized on these facts as evidence of deeper problems: budgetary shortfalls, administrative corruption, or a culture of neglect, while defenders argued that the escape was a result of a small number of bad actors exploiting circumstances that had, up to that point, gone unpunished or unnoticed. In the days that followed, politicians demanded immediate investigations. State authorities began to audit the facility, and the national gaze turned toward a city already familiar with public controversies over law enforcement and corrections. The photograph of the whole, the scrawled mocking message, and the sight of orange jumpsuits disappearing into the city offered a dramatic shorthand for failure. It was one thing to report an escape. It was another to force community to confront what had been allowed to persist. At the human level, the event had a chilling double life. Families of victims who had already experienced the slow legal rhythms of trials and sentencing watched live broadcasts with growing dread. For them, an escape was not an abstract administrative failure, but renewal trauma. The people who had lost loved ones saw not just headlines, but renewed fear that their tormentor might walk free and seek retribution or more violence. For corrections officers, too, the story was complex. Many described working under chronic staffing shortages and with outdated equipment, and while public anger focused on individual failure, many in the field insisted the problem was deeper, structural, an accumulation of small deficits that shifted the balance from containment to risk. Public trust erodes in such intersections where human suffering is proximate to administrative decline. The initial phase of the story, a jail in pre-dawn, a hole behind a toilet, 10 men gone, was merely the overture. It was cinematic in its images, but the drama that followed would be bureaucratic, legal, and human in equal measure, a multi-state manhunt, the arrest of alleged inside collaborators, a city's demand for accountability, and finally the long pursuit for a man the press would call, at times, a ghost. That first morning had opened a story that would not close until months later, and even then it would raise as many questions as it answered. In the months that followed, investigators and journalists would lay bare a sequence of lapses and contested claims, and aggregate served as a cautionary tale about the fragility of systems meant to hold the state's most dangerous offenders away from the public. To tell how the escape unfolded, one must understand the spatial and institutional context from which it emerged. The Orleans Parish Justice Center was conceived as a corrective instrument. Its architecture, concrete walls, surveillance arrays, and controlled access points was designed to contain those whom the law had adjudicated as dangerous or deserving of custody. Yet the lived reality of the facility diverged from its architectural promise. Years of deferred maintenance, underfunding, and chronic understaffing had created a day-to-day environment in which small failures became persistent ones. The department's own maintenance logs and worker complaints, later reviewed by investigators, showed repeated requests for camera repairs, door replacements, and plumbing fixes that had not been completed. When a system of care requires ongoing labor and attention, the absence of such upkeep is not neutral. It produces a landscape of opportunity for those inside the institution who are willing to look for it. Within this institutional landscape, prisoner routines acquire tactical meaning. Guards make rounds, equipment alerts blink in a central room, and maintenance workers move through corridors fixing the anomalies that arise in a facility of that size. Those rhythms are predictable and therefore perceptible. Investigators later noted that the men who planned the escape had watched and waited, familiarizing themselves with the timing of rounds, the blind spots in camera coverage, and the moments when maintenance was least likely to be monitored. Knowledge inside a carceral setting accrues in small increments. A door that sticks, a light that fails, a worker who arrives on a certain cart. The escape exploited these small increments. Its success lay not in any single spectacular trick, but in a careful accumulation of such details. The physical breach that made the escape possible originated in a mundane place. The base of a toilet in one cell, identified later as Cell 6 Bottom. The act that preceded the removal of that fixture was simple in conception and tedious in execution. Bolts were loosened, plumbing connections were disabled, and the unit was wrenched outward once the water supply had been stopped. That stoppage, the investigators discovered, had not occurred spontaneously. A maintenance worker had been involved in turning off water to enable the disassembly, the subject of one of the earliest arrests related to the case. Once the hole existed, a tunnel through the fabric of the building was revealed. An access route into the maintenance pathways, then into service corridors, and finally toward the loading dock where a fence offered the last physical barrier to freedom. The escape, in other words, required knowledge of where to make the smallest cut and how to navigate the hidden arteries of the building. The plumbing, the vents, the layered corridors that are ordinarily invisible in a complaint about criminal justice, but visible to those who study a building's anatomy. The human dynamics were equally consequential. The escape reflected a collaboration among inmates and, allegedly, among people who work for the sheriff's office. One arrest that drew considerable attention was that of a maintenance worker charged with malfeasance in office and with assisting the escape. Prosecutors alleged that this worker had turned off the water to the relevant cell, a small action that enabled the inmates to remove the toilet. The worker, in his statements, later claimed coercion, an allegation that introduces moral ambiguity into the narrative. Where does a threatened person's responsibility end and the coercer's culpability begin? The law tries to parse such lines, but the social reality inside a jail is often a thicket of duress, fear, and institutional weakness. Whatever legal responsibility will be adjudicated in court will not fully settle the ethical tensions the case exposed. Another human figure who surfaced in the unfolding story was a former correctional employee who had become a civilian and later was alleged to have been an outside contact for one of the escapees. Named in arrest affidavits as having been in recent phone contact and implicated in transporting an escapee following the jailbreak, she represented the porousness of boundaries between inside and outside the facility. When the public imagines jail, it often imagines an impermeable wall between society and those punished. In practice, those walls are rarely impermeable. Family, friends, and sometimes former co-workers form a web of relationships that blurs the inside/outside distinction. The case made that blurring painfully clear. What if the plan did not only rely on a hole behind a toilet, but on the ability to move in the social world beyond the wall? Money, rides, temporary shelter? The city's political landscape amplified the tensions. The sheriff's office, responsible for daily operations and for reporting to elected officials and the public, found itself in a defensive posture. Questions followed swiftly. Had officials asked for more resources and been denied? Had maintenance requests been shelved? Did supervisors fail to conduct required rounds? The governor's office ordered audits. The state attorney general took a hands-on role in the investigation, and civic groups pressed for transparent accountability. In the court of public opinion, administrative failures, and the moral horror of violent offenders at large combined into an excruciating pressure on local officials. Those pressures had electoral consequences, not just immediate legal ones, and the narrative of incompetence or worse could be politically ruinous. Yet even amid institutional finger-pointing, the event retained a simple human core. 10 people used the tools accessible to them to attempt to regain freedom. For the escapees, the calculation was distinctly different. Some had been convicted of murder and faced long sentences. Others were awaiting trial. For them, the calculus of risk, fear, and potential reprieve tipped in favor of a desperate act. One could analyze the facility's structural failings, the maintenance backlog, and the political choices for funding. One could also hear in the escape the raw human desire to flee confinement. The two perspectives, systems and human longing, do not cancel each other out. Instead, they intertwine to make the event both a policy scandal and a story of human agency. As the city's response unfolded, press conferences, criminal complaints, and the first arrests, the narrative took on the contours of an inquiry into the kinds of governance that permit such episodes. What appeared at first glance as a single night's escape was quickly revealed to be the product of repeated small permissions. Permission to ignore maintenance requests, permission to tolerate understaffing, permission to defer accountability. The hole in the wall was a vivid symbol of those permissions. The scrawled mocking line was a public taunt that echoed the private complacencies of the institution. The courtroom battles had come to have to parse intent and coercion, but the political task was, in some sense, simpler. Repair the holes so they could not be exploited again. That repair would require budgets, people, and a public willingness to prioritize the unseen labor that holds a civic infrastructure together. The morning the escape was discovered, the city woke into panic. In the early light, helicopters circled above Orleans Parish, and squad cars patrolled neighborhoods that had not seen such heavy police presence in years. News anchors broke into regular broadcasts, repeating the same phrase: 10 inmates missing from the Orleans Parish Justice Center. The figure alone, 10, carried an unnerving weight. 1 or 2 might have been an accident. 10 meant coordination. 10 meant planning. And if 10 had escaped, how many had helped? Inside the sheriff's office, emergency meetings began before sunrise. Investigators from multiple agencies filled a command room with photographs, maps, and printouts of inmate files. One by one, they pinned mugshots to a wall, drawing circles around names, highlighting known associates, and marking potential routes of flight. Within hours, the U.S. Marshal Service and the Louisiana State Police joined the search, transforming what began as a local embarrassment into a statewide crisis. The first priority was containment, preventing the fugitives from leaving the state. But Louisiana's porous geography, crisscrossed with interstate highways and surrounded by dense bayou country, offered more hiding places than anyone wanted to admit. Each hour that passed without a sighting deepened the sense of unease. Families of victims demanded to know how men convicted of murder could have simply walked out of custody. Reporters gathered outside the jail, shouting questions at deputies who had no answers to give. Inside, investigators began retracing every moment of the preceding night. When the maintenance logs were signed, who turned the water off, which guard were on duty, and when the last head count had been performed. The picture that emerged was one of exhaustion and dysfunction. Guards working double shifts, cameras that had been offline for weeks, and alarms that could be silenced manually. It was a system patched together by routine rather than oversight, one that could function in calm weather but not under pressure. By mid-morning, the first leads began to appear. A delivery driver passing near the jail's loading dock had noticed movement before dawn. Figures in orange darting across the road toward a vacant lot. Another witness reported seeing two men climbing into a waiting vehicle a few blocks away. License plate data led to the first break. A dark sedan registered to an acquaintance of one of the inmates had been spotted heading east toward Slidell before disappearing from traffic cameras. The pattern suggested coordination beyond the jail walls. Someone on the outside had been waiting. By afternoon, police in neighboring parishes were setting up checkpoints, stopping vehicles and questioning drivers along major highways. Rumors began to spread that the fugitives were armed, that they had taken hostages, that they had split into groups. Most of these proved untrue, but in the fog of crisis, fear filled the gaps that facts had not yet reached. Schools went on lockdown. Businesses closed early. In New Orleans, a city accustomed to tragedy and resilience in equal measure, the thought that violent offenders might be moving freely through its streets struck at something deeper than fear. It challenged the sense that the system itself was functioning. For investigators, the breakthrough came not from technology, but from human error. One of the escapees, desperate for money, attempted to use a relative's phone to contact someone for help. That call, traced by authorities, led officers to a small apartment on the city's outskirts. When they arrived, they found two of the 10 escapees hiding under a mattress. The arrests were quiet, but the message was loud. The manhunt had begun to close in. From that point forward, the fugitives' advantage, the element of surprise, evaporated. In the days that followed, 8 of the 10 men were captured across Louisiana and Mississippi. Some were found within hours, exhausted and hungry, hiding in drainage ditches or abandoned houses. Others had made it further, assisted by acquaintances who later claimed they acted out of fear or sympathy. But 2 names continued to elude every search: Derrick Groves, the convicted killer, and one accomplice whose record was less severe, but whose cunning seemed to match his leaders. As the days stretched into weeks, public interest narrowed to those 2 names. Groves, it seemed, had vanished. Law enforcement expanded the search radius. The U.S. Marshals, working with the FBI, began tracking bank records, phone pings, and surveillance footage across state lines. Every few days, new reports surfaced. A possible sighting in Baton Rouge, a tip from Alabama, an abandoned vehicle in Georgia. Each lead generated a small wave of attention, then receded into silence. Groves was becoming a ghost story, an absence that consumed resources and attention while producing no closure. For the sheriff's office, the crisis deepened into scandal. Multiple employees were suspended or reassigned. An internal investigation confirmed that several security cameras had been non-functional for more than 6 weeks. The public learned that repair requests had been filed and ignored. Maintenance contractors admitted that their shifts were reduced to cut costs. The facility, which had been promoted as a modern correctional center, was revealed to be running on the edge of failure. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, and local officials struggled to contain the political fallout. The story soon took on a moral dimension. For families of Groves' victims, the escape reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. They appeared on local news stations, pleading for justice and safety. One mother spoke through tears, saying, "I thought the worst part of my life was over when he was sentenced. Now I have to sleep wondering if he's out there." Their pain personalized what might otherwise have been a bureaucratic failure. It reminded viewers that justice, when breached, is not just a matter of walls and locks. It is a matter of trust. Weeks turned into months. Each passing day made Groves' recapture less likely. Investigators worked quietly, following financial trails and monitoring known associates. They discovered that Groves had a network of friends and relatives stretching beyond Louisiana, contacts in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. One of those contacts, a woman he had met years earlier, became a focus of surveillance after investigators learned she had recently quit her job and moved to Atlanta. In late September 2025, the breakthrough came. A tip reached authorities in Atlanta. A man matching Groves' description had been seen entering a small apartment complex in the city's western outskirts. He was using an alias, paying in cash, and keeping irregular hours. Federal agents began a slow, methodical watch, confirming his identity through discarded trash, fingerprints on soda cans, and a quiet check of security footage from nearby stores. By October, the confirmation was complete. It was him. The capture itself unfolded with precision. On October 8th, a team of U.S. Marshals and Atlanta police surrounded the complex. Residents were told to stay indoors. Negotiators made contact, urging Groves to surrender peacefully. For several tense minutes, there was no response. Then, according to reports, a voice from inside shouted, "I'm done running." Moments later, Groves stepped out, hands visible, his expression blank. The fugitive hunt that had stretched across 4 states ended not with violence, but with quiet inevitability. When he was escorted back to Louisiana, reporters lined the airport fence. Flashbulbs cut through the night as Groves emerged in handcuffs, flanked by officers. His face betrayed no emotion, no triumph, no remorse. For law enforcement, it was a moment of relief. For the city, it was something closer to exhaustion. The escape that had humiliated local authorities was finally over. But the questions it raised about negligence, corruption, and the fragility of justice remained unanswered. Behind the scenes, investigators continued their work. Several individuals faced charges for aiding the escape. The maintenance worker accused of shutting off the water, the former correctional employee who provided outside assistance, and others who had hidden or transported fugitives. Each case revealed another thread in the web of complicity that had allowed the plan to succeed. It was not a single act of brilliance, investigators concluded, but the accumulation of small, tolerated failures. The manhunt had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. When the dust settled, the city began to take stock of what the escape had revealed. The sheriff's office released a lengthy internal report acknowledging multiple points of failure: poor maintenance, inadequate staffing, lax supervision, and an over-reliance on outdated technology. The report confirmed what many had already suspected. The Orleans Parish Justice Center, despite its modern facade, had been operating in conditions that made failure inevitable. The public read the report with a mix of outrage and resignation. In New Orleans, institutional collapse had long been part of the civic rhythm. This time, though, the cause was harder to ignore. Several officials resigned under pressure. Others promised reform. The mayor's office announced a task force to audit every aspect of the city's detention system, from procurement contracts to employee training. Federal agencies pledged support, though their involvement also signaled a deeper embarrassment that local governance could no longer be trusted to manage its own correctional infrastructure. For those who had lost faith in the city's leadership, the escape confirmed their worst fears, that incompetence was no longer the exception but the rule. For the families of victims, the return of Derrick Groves offered little comfort. Justice, once shaken, cannot be easily restored. One victim's sister said in an interview, "He's back in the cell, but what about the people who let this happen? What about the ones who helped him?" Her question pointed to the larger moral vacuum at the heart of the case. Groves' escape was not only about his actions, it was about the failures of others to uphold their duties. In the eyes of the public, the lines between guilt and responsibility had blurred. As Groves awaited new charges related to the escape, his story became the subject of podcasts, documentaries, and endless online speculation. People debated whether his ability to evade capture for months reflected cunning, luck, or incompetence on the part of authorities. Theories circulated about where he had gone, who had sheltered him, and whether he had planned to turn himself in. But those questions obscured the larger story. A city forced to confront its own vulnerability. In the courtroom months later, Groves appeared thinner, quieter, older. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he simply nodded. His silence in that moment spoke louder than any confession could. The spectacle of his return was over. What remained was the dull machinery of justice grinding forward once again. Yet outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, not to defend him, but to demand reform. Their signs read, "Fix the system before it fails again." For law enforcement, the manhunt became both cautionary tale and training exercise. The marshals used it as a case study in interagency cooperation. The sheriff's office instituted new inspection protocols. Cameras were repaired, staffing levels temporarily increased, and maintenance logs digitized. But institutional memory fades fast, and as one veteran officer put it, every crisis teaches the same lesson. Then time passes and people forget. The psychological aftermath lingered longer than the administrative one. For guards and staff who had lived through the chaos, trust in the system eroded. For inmates still inside, the escape became legend, a whispered story about the night 10 men breached the unbreachable. Some saw it as a tale of daring. Others as proof that even failure could expose hypocrisy. Within the jail's walls, the event became myth, retold in fragments and half-truths, echoing through corridors that still bore the scars of the hole left behind. In the broader community, the story faded from headlines but remained alive in memory. For a time, New Orleans carried the unease that follows any rupture of order. People looked differently at the jail when they drove past it, aware that beneath its concrete surface, vulnerabilities persisted. For those who believed in the justice system, the escape was a warning. For those who distrusted it, it was confirmation. Months later, when the city quietly installed new fencing and security systems, there were no cameras, no speeches, no ceremony. The repairs were a practical act, an attempt to erase a symbol. But symbols rarely vanish so easily. The image of that hole in the wall, the graffiti left behind, and the long manhunt that followed had already imprinted themselves onto the city's collective consciousness. In the end, the great New Orleans escape became less a story about criminals and more a story about institutions, about what happens when vigilance gives way to complacency, when corners are cut, and when a fragile boundary between safety and chaos is taken for granted. The moral, if there is one, is quiet but persistent. Justice is not secured by walls alone. It depends on attention, on integrity, and on the everyday discipline of those entrusted with it. When those virtues fail, even the strongest concrete can crack. Stories like this remind us that behind every headline lies a chain of human choices. Some brave, some careless, and some that reveal how fragile order can be. The great New Orleans escape wasn't only about one man's flight from justice. It was about how a city confronts its own reflection in the aftermath. If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think about justice, accountability, or the people working behind the scenes to rebuild trust, consider joining us here on this journey of truth and discovery. Every story we tell is part of something larger, a growing community that believes understanding crime isn't about fear, but about learning from what it reveals about us all. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us continue uncovering the stories that shape the world we live in. Together, we're building something new, something honest, something that looks deeper than the headline.